So I would suggest that we start with our conference opening event. There might be some other people coming late, given the rain and any kind of problems with the Friday afternoon traffic, but nevertheless, I would suggest that we start. So please take a seat. Okay, so welcome. Welcome to the Center for International Development. My name is Werner Raza. I'm very happy that we can all welcome you here in our center for a weekend of debates and discussions on international trade, on the shifts in the international order that are going currently currently going on. And tonight we'll have the opportunity to, start our discussions with, I think, a very interesting panel discussion. Afterwards, we'll have the chance to a first exchange and a first debate before we then move on to an informal part where we offer you some drinks and snacks. Okay, so an organization or a conference like this would not be possible without the help of many people, of many organizations. In fact, actually, 6 organizations have cooperated, both organizations located here in Austria, in Vienna, but also at the European Union level. These organizations are the Austrian Foundation for Development Research, and I'm working here for the Austrian Foundation for Development Research. The second organization is the Department of Development Studies of the University of Vienna, who will be introduced tomorrow in the morning to you. The third organization is Attac Austria. The fourth organization, which has been very active on trade policy issues also in the Austrian polity, is the network Anders Handeln, Trade Differently, which is also a network of different civil society organizations and trade unions. The fifth organization is the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation Brussels. And the sixth organization, last but not least, is Arbeiterkammer Wien. And precisely to Valentin Wedel from the Arbeiterkammer Wien, I would like to pass the word on now to give his words of welcome. And after Valentin, Florian Horn from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation Brussels will also extend words of welcome to you. And then we will start our panel discussion. So again, welcome to all of you. I'm looking forward to our discussions this weekend. I hope you feel welcome here and familiar with the venue here. I hope the weather tomorrow will be a little bit better, but nevertheless, have a good time here in Vienna, and please, Valentin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Werner. So on behalf of the Chamber of Labor, I would like to welcome all of you as well for this conference here. To the foreign guests, just a very brief introduction what the Chamber of Labor is. I just have 3 minutes, so I will just take 1 minute for the introductions. One is that we are a so-called self-governing body according to Austrian constitutional law. This is extremely complicated, and I'll come to the second explanation. We are a trade union think tank, and as a trade union think tank, we are very determined to trade policy, because the Austrian trade union movement, together with a big network of NGOs and other players, is very strong and created a sort of a critical intellectual mask in having a very critical view on trade policy and globalization policy. This is taking place here since a lot of years, and I'm kind of proud, actually, that we managed in Austria to have a very strong resistance even against the Mercosur agreement, for instance, but also other agreements as well, where a lot of people are fighting since a couple of years. And I see Penny Clark here, who is very strong in our Brussels network. Oliver Brausmüller can't be here today, he has to be with his child. And we are very strong, actually, and we managed to be powerful and creating an international network. That's fantastic. What we also are, as Chamber of Labor, we are so-called a social partner institution. There is no common position among the social partners in Austria about trade policy and about globalization. We are completely split and divided on that issue. but still we are deemed relevant and powerful, and all the social partners very often get all kinds of invitations to networks, informal networks, to meetings organized by ministries or by other embassies, and so on and so on. And one impression I really got from all these meetings is when we talk to the other side of the Chamber of Economy or to the Federation of Industrialists, and this is quite new. This is an impression I got, I would like to share with you. They really have no answers anymore. They have no answers when it comes to the challenges of this time. They have no answers about green transition unless opening up even more the financial markets and everything will go fine. But they would present this as a possible solution to anything anyway, all the time. So they have no answer anymore, and they have no idea. So what I really expect from us, and what I think is very possible, that we can create a very strong breeding ground for fresh ideas. That's something that is needed, not only in the sense of global solidarity and global justice, so even more to manage and to cope with the big challenges of this time, particularly in terms of a social and ecological transition. So I would pass further on to you now, the micro, wishing us all a very fruitful discussion, and let's believe in the power of ideas. We shouldn't underestimate us.
Yeah, hello, on behalf of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation Brussels office. I'm very happy to be here to join a 3-day discussion about the future of trade to come. And I would ask you to allow me to take my 3 minutes of introduction to talk about the past of trade. I will not talk about Rosa Luxemburg Foundation because it would bore most of you, because actually many of you I know already because of my personal past of trade policies. Because I work in Rosa Luxemburg Foundation now for 10 years. I started in 2014 in Brussels. This was when the so-called TTIP negotiations became a very sensitive topic and a huge mobilization all across Europe. And so many of the people who are here now, I met in that year, and we discussed and made campaigns and so on to stop these trade negotiations. And if you don't know what Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is, just ask the person sitting next to you very quietly. Yeah. So what happened after that? TTIP didn't get through. There was a huge mobilization in Germany, 250,000 people in the streets at one point. 2016, then the Brexit came. Also somewhat trade related, because it's like quite a big internal market of free movement of goods and services and so on, and it just got little cracks. In 2017 then, Donald Trump came. Also somehow trade related, because we all know these discussions about NAFTA and so on, and how he changed the trade policies of the United States to make America great again trade direction. But we also have to keep in mind that this is not the one shot of one president, but these are more longer developments. We also had President Bush did some kind of tariffs on steel already in the 2000s, and President Obama, he was pivoting to Asia and doing tariffs on tires from China. So, and even now we see that after Trump, not everything is going back to before Trump, and maybe that's a good thing. What came next? Not that Trump was there was a good thing, but that not everything is wrong that someone does that we don't like. That's what I said. Next came then 2019-ish. There was these Amazon wildfires, and there was the EU signing the Mercosur agreement. So what the EU is doing for years and years and years is they just don't react to the changes. They just go on the way they have been going, in the way of opening market policies. And then the impacts got faster and more severe, and we had the corona crisis, and suddenly everyone was hunting for medication, for vaccines, for masks and so on, and we didn't see any rule-based system there, and everyone was having a good agreement with everyone, but it was everyone for himself. And then, of course, now 2022, the war came, the war began, which also has a bit to do with the trade agreement, because there was this 2014 EU-Ukraine association agreement, which kind of shaked a bit the political landscape in the Ukraine also. So you see a lot of things that's happening around us are trade related, and the impacts are getting faster and heavier. And now we have this, what we call in Germany, the cost of living crisis, high inflation. And what will be the reaction of the EU and national leaderships, we don't know, but hopefully it will not be more of the same. And therefore I hope we get some good inspiration from this conference to have some good alternative proposals on how the future of trade can be shaped. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with the panel discussion. So I might ask and welcome Sandra Polaski, Luciana Ghiotto, and Jürgen Knirsch, who's not yet with us, to join me on the floor, on the podium, sorry. Please take a seat. You would like to sit over there, perhaps? Oh, okay, that's no problem. Okay, so we hope that Jürgen will join us in a couple of minutes. He's been stuck in the traffic, given the bad weather. But nevertheless, let's start with our roundtable discussion. As was already mentioned by both Florian and Valentin, the idea for this conference was, things are really changing very rapidly at the international level, at the European level. We see, the climate catastrophe, I think we have to call it, really, advancing very quickly with very bad results for the not only the environment but also for people. We see the, if you want, after pains of the COVID pandemic. We see the cost of living crisis. We see the war in Ukraine and many other conflicts, by the way. And apparently, to some extent, the political systems react to what's happening. We see now the emergence of industrial policy discussions. We see the emergence of, you might call it protectionism, or at least protectionist policies. So we see a change also in the discourse, I would argue. And the question emerges, what does that mean for progressive civil society and the critical trade movement, both in the European Union but also at the global level. So that has been the motivation for this conference, to bring together intellectuals, researchers, critical researchers particularly, with people from the progressive civil society and social movements to discuss, firstly, what's really going on, how can we make sense out of that. I think there's a lot of interpretation or interpretative work, analytical work needed here. And secondly, of course, we'd like to discuss with all of you and also with our guests here on the podium, how should we respond to that? Does that kind of entail any kind of changes in terms of the policies that we've been advocating for the last 20 years, 25 years, 30 years? What new elements need to be brought into the debate, which priorities perhaps should be shifted? So that's the second part of the discussion that we would like to have with you. And we want to provide some kind of an overture tonight on these two, if you want, big sets of issues. So let me shortly introduce our guests tonight. The first is Sandra Polaski. Sandra Polaski has been for many years a policymaker, researcher, and also advocate on trade, labor, and income policies at the national and international level. She has served in many functions amongst others. For example, she's been the Deputy Director General for Policy of the International Labour Organization and was its Sherpa to the G20. Earlier, she also worked in the US Department of Labor's International Labor Affairs Bureau, where she negotiated labor provisions in international trade agreements. And before that, she also worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, actually where I came across your work in the early 2000s. Now she's currently affiliated with Boston University as a senior research scholar and a member, and is also a member of the Independent Mexico Labor Expert Board, created by the US Congress to monitor and advise on Mexican labor policy in the context of the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is a very interesting agreement, which I think was concluded in 2020, and has in a way replaced the very controversial NAFTA agreement. So welcome to Vienna. Thanks a lot for coming to us, and we look forward to our discussions. Next is Luciana Ghiotto. Luciana is a professor of international political economy at the National University of San Martin in Argentina. She's also an associate researcher at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. Her work focuses on the human rights, social and environmental impacts of trade liberalization in particular. I think perhaps 1.5 years ago, you published a widely disseminated and received critical study on the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, which you did, I think, for the European Parliament. So also, thanks a lot for coming from Argentina, which is a long journey, to Vienna, and taking the time to discuss with us here. Okay, so let's perhaps start with a first round of questions that I would like to address and ask for your thoughts on that. As I said, I think one critical area to do of intellectual work, if you want, is to make sense out of all these changes that are happening. So we see this kind of geopolitical shifts. We see the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. We see, follow-on policies on trade and investment issues, on all kinds of international policy areas, actually, that are now impacted by that kind of geopolitical rivalry. So my first question to Sandra, to you would be, how is your take on what's really going on? How does that change this kind of geopolitical shift, change the situation also, and the environment in which trade policy and investment policies, and we have a rather broad understanding of trade and investment policies, with this so-called new trade agenda, which includes all kinds of issues. How is that impacted? And what's going to be, changing perhaps in the near-term future also in terms of how major international powers, the superpowers, the United States, China, and others, what kind of policies they will likely implement. And what does that, what does that really mean? What's your take on that? Just give you the microphone here.
Thank you, Werner. Well, those are very broad questions. Let me start for this first round in talking about two key shifts in the U.S. Political perspective or U.S. political consensus that I think explain a lot of what the U.S. has been doing in the last few years and give a guide, if you will, to what will be coming down the pike. And we can come back to all of these things in detail, but I think it's important to understand the sort of causal relationships of these two key shifts, very different shifts. The first one is what I would call the breakdown or crack up of the neoliberal consensus in the U.S. elite. So the neoliberal consensus, I don't think I need to explain to you what we mean by neoliberal. It means preferencing the rights of capital. It means deferring to the market, shrinking government, opening international markets for capital, et cetera, et cetera. That was very much the dominant elite consensus in the US from the late 80s until, well, I'll come to that. So that consensus in terms of trade and investment policy meant that in trade agreements and investment negotiations, the US was seeking maximum rights for US capital. Capital mobility, constraints, not allowing other countries to have capital constraints, great protections for investors, the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Clause, which many of you probably know about, protections, extreme protections for intellectual property rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. that protection for U.S. capital to go abroad was being built at the same time, and certainly more than a coincidence, at the time of the breakdown of the socialist bloc and the entry of China into the global economy. And what those two movements meant was that, in effect, the global labor force available for capitalist production, or capitalist exploitation, if you will, at least doubled in the course of a couple of years. So now you have capital in general, US capital in particular in terms of US policy, going abroad, being met with an enormous increase in the labor force, many of whom, particularly in China, were very, very low paid at that time, not anymore, but at that time. And this led to massive offshoring. In other words, moving out of production in the US, in manufacturing, also to some degree in services, call centers, engineering services, et cetera, et cetera. And for the US, that meant that places where the industrial production was concentrated or the services were concentrated, there were some very severe losses. Losses of jobs, losses of wages, and communities that were concentrated in those affected industries would see downward spirals. People were laid off, they had less money, the jobs that were available were very poor quality jobs, not enough to absorb everybody, less local tax revenue, which in the US funds public education, so that meant education went down, public health services, et cetera, et cetera. And so you saw these very severe impacts in communities in many, many parts of the US, particularly across the industrial Midwest and the industrial Southeast. So that was the picture in the US. It did not shake the consensus of neoliberalism until 2016, when Donald Trump, who is a very, very shrewd political analyst and maneuverer, recognized that those very legitimate grievances could be weaponized against his opponent, Hillary Clinton, who he was able to characterize with some justice as a very strong opponent of neoliberalism. He won the election, and in terms of the US complicated electoral system, he won the election because of his victories in 3 states, 3 industrial states that had a large concentration of these devastated communities, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which had been seen as a blue wall in the US that the Democrats would never lose. They could always count on that in the electoral calculus, but they lost all 3 of them. The effect was a rupture in the neoliberal consensus in general, but particularly in the Democratic Party, which now saw that its route to governance, its route to the presidency, appeared to be destroyed, blocked at least. And so in 2020, in the campaign for the next presidential campaign, all of the candidates, including Joe Biden, who was on the conservative wing of the Democratic candidates, pledged no new free trade agreements until we have an industrial policy, until we reindustrialize, until we rebuild the US economy. And whenever we do move forward with free trade agreements, we will have very strong labor clauses like you had not seen before. We will have no investor-state dispute settlement clauses, et cetera, et cetera. And Biden went on that, and he has kept those promises, which we'll come back to probably later in talking about US policy now. So that was the first big shift. You could say the breakup of neoliberalism as a dominant consensus. Certainly not replaced by a consensus in favor of labor rights, by a consensus in favor of a strong social policy. That consensus doesn't exist, but it was the breakup of the neoliberal consensus with respect to international economic policy. The second big shift, which is quite distinct from that, although it has some feeding forces from the first shift, is the rise of the anti-China consensus, of a aggressive, belligerent anti-China consensus. There has been anti-Chinese sentiment in the US, well, for as long as the US has existed, and it's fairly deep in certain parts of the US population, but during this period of neoliberalism, because of the focus on the interests of capital, China was seen as an opportunity, not as an enemy, but as an opportunity. But as China approached the technological frontier, as we would think about it in economic terms, as China grew richer, as China became a more important trading partner for others in the world, gradually the wing of the US elite, which has always been there, what we call the hawks, or the neoconservatives, the ideological wing, which aggressively defends US hegemony, including through military action, has become more and more dominant. And I would say at the moment it is the single most dominant trend. It's not fully consolidated. It's not, I would argue, not yet a consensus in the US to be moving in this direction, which leads to escalation with China. But it's a very, very strong force. And it's a force which leads to intimidation of scholars, for example. Academics who speak in favor of a more restrained approach to China are intimidated, are harassed publicly, in some cases denied opportunities, academic opportunities. Politicians are afraid to not be seen as tough enough on China, and with an election coming up next year in the US, you can only expect this will get worse for the next 16, 18 months. And probably most importantly, in the atmosphere of extremely polarized politics in the US, which I'm sure you're all somewhat aware of, this very quickly can lead to escalation. So that in terms of policy making, if Biden is seen as not being tough enough on China, which he's frequently accused of, he then responds, particularly going into an election year, by getting tougher on China. And China responds by having to respond. I mean, this is the dynamic of escalation. And when they respond, the Republicans say Biden hasn't done enough. So the logic of escalation is built in, it's baked in by the extreme polarization of US politics. In other words, it's a very, very dangerous moment. Now, the concatenation of these two key changes, the breakup of the neoliberal consensus and the move toward industrial policy, the move toward a worker-centered trade policy, which is the buzz, that and the anti-China hegemony, or however you want to characterize it, they're very different. I mean, the anti-China sentiment from the deindustrialization fed this new anti-China approach, but it's not the dominant force. And the conclusions lead in somewhat different directions. A reaction against neoliberalism can lead to some very progressive policies. A reaction to create a new Cold War and escalate to the point of real war is not progressive and leads in a very different direction. And so when you see very confusing things about US foreign policy and US trade policy right now, and you do see very confusing things, it's because these two shifts in the US ideology are working in tension with each other. They're not necessarily in contradiction, but they're definitely in tension. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sandra, for that very interesting remarks on how you see the situation evolving and what explains the somewhat confusing or contradictory politics of the United States vis-a-vis not only China, but also vis-a-vis international economic affairs in general. So I would say we see some kind of the evolving of what Karl Polanyi called the double movement, a movement, you know, where you have the forces of marketization that have led in some way to a social response, and that partially explains, I would say, the increase and the renaissance of authoritarian nationalisms. And on the other hand, and that's obviously what we're interested here particularly in, is the second movement perhaps leading or showing us ways also towards some kind of a progressive answer to what's gone wrong in the last 20 years. Just coming back to your remarks on what has changed in the US elites, I think one of the things that perhaps most surprised me when, as an observer of US politics in the last 10 years, was that this kind of what you call the hawks, they've become so strong again vis-a-vis China, because even if you think that, you know, China has become some kind of a competitor to the United States also in high-tech products, one would perhaps assume in a very, you know, traditional political economy framework, well, you know, US big corporations, Wall Street, they're so heavily invested in China, you know, Apple and many others, they will not allow US politics to go towards that very confrontative stance towards China. And that apparently was a wrong assumption on my part, because politics in that sense has trumped economics, if you want, insofar as the negative repercussions of trade liberalization, hyperglobalizations on particular economic sectors, particular fragments of the US population have led to this very, you know, strong political backlash in the States. And that's something that I think for a long time has been underestimated also in by many people probably, and that's something that's now dominating US policy. Okay, so thanks a lot for that first round. Let me move perhaps to Luciana, and let me also welcome Jürgen Knirsch, who's joined us. Thanks a lot for joining us, and I will introduce you in a moment. But first, perhaps let me move to Luciana, and as I already remarked, Luciana has been working a lot on trade policy, particularly from a South American or Latin American perspective. And it seems that also things are changing in Latin America itself. Political dynamics, to some extent at least, have changed. We have these new kind of pink-tide governments. We have particularly the electoral success of Lula in Brazil. And we have also some other center-left, progressive, whatever you might call them, governments in other countries, Colombia, Chile, other countries in Latin America. And there seems to be also, speaking about the geopolitical approach of these new governments, to be, if you want, a renaissance of South-South cooperation in a way. We've seen that in the early 2000s already with the BRICS. So how is this kind of geopolitical shift impacting Latin America, and what's really happening also on the ground in Latin America with respect to these changes, and how do you see the situation evolving in that continent?
Is this working? Yes. Okay. Well, that were like many questions, very big. It's not fair because sometimes Sandra had to answer on the US. I have to answer for a whole continent, but I will. Anyway, no, I think that first of all, I was listening to your question, Werner, and I think that I would have some differences with the point of departure of the idea of things are changing in Latin America. I think that we are here to analyze trade issues, and when we analyze trade issues, and afterwards I will say some more things about how we understand trade, but regarding Latin America, I think that we have to understand how Latin America as a whole has developed and has entered the global market. So what does, and this is like an interesting question, what does Latin America, from Mexico downwards, have to offer the world right now, from a capitalist point of view? And this is a very important question. Why? Because what we see is that, of course, we have 500 years of dependency, of colony, of selling raw materials and receiving produced manufactured materials in return. And this trend that we see for 500 years has actually deepened in the past 3 decades. Why? What we see is that we have never really in Latin America, we have not been able as a whole to get out of that reality. So when we see governments changing, what we don't see is actually the trend changing. This has not been able to be changed by governments, by individual governments. What we see as a whole, as a region is, and regarding trade, which is actually what gets us together in this conference, is the fact that Latin America has still is the region that provides Europe, the US, China nowadays, with raw materials regarding things that we find in nature. So that is still the reality. Things that are under the soil, so we find oil, gas, minerals in general, coal in Colombia, we have copper in Chile, we have iron ore in Brazil, we have gold, we have plate, and blah, 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 and uranium and other things. Then the things that we find in the seas, salmon, shrimp, fishes in general, right? So you are great consumers of these products that come from Chile, for example, Chile salmon. Well, you have Spain also providing this, but there's a lot of salmon that is consumed with lots of antibiotics, right? Because this extraction comes with a system of how we extract these things. Things in the fields, soy, for example, Argentina sells soy, sells beef, meat, right? Sells orange juice, Brazil sells orange juice, Central America sells cinnamon, sells coffee, Ecuador, Colombia, coffees, flowers, cocoa for the Lindt chocolate from Switzerland, produced in Europe, but with African or Latin American cocoa, right? Cocoa, yes, for chocolate. Then you have what you get in other parts of nature. You have, what else? I'm missing something. No, well, from the forests, of course. So what we have is natural products in exchange for high value added products like vaccines, like medicines in general, like vessels, helicopters, motors, and stuff like that that we receive. And that was one of the main critiques to the Mercosur-EU agreement, right? So Latin America is in a kind of trap right now. And it doesn't depend solely or mostly on governments. It's a systemical way of the countries to have entered global markets in the last part of capitalism, what we call globalization, or also called internationalization of capital. And what we find is that Latin America doesn't have what East Asian countries or China have offered the world, which is cheap labor. It's not that we don't have cheap labor, but companies, as Sandra was saying, have mainly fled from Europe and the US, and some from Canada, but mainly US and Europe have fled to Southeast Asia and not to Latin America. So that is a kind of trap. That's why I'm saying, because there has always been a trend in the past. The 20th century has been, we can read the history of Latin America as a search to advance in industrial development that came in a little bit, and then it flew away again with, for example, the dictatorships, right? Pinochet in Chile, 50 years of Pinochet government will be this year. I mean, from the coup d'etat to President Salvador Allende. So what we have is the eternal search for development that never comes. That is what we see as a general. From Mexico downwards, I mean, Brazil and Mexico are the countries that have received the biggest amount of foreign direct investment, but nonetheless, it's still related to producing for the US market, for example, in the case of Mexico. So this is a trap, and I want to finish with this idea, the idea that although we see now a lot of people are talking about the second pink tide, like with President Gabriel Boric in Chile, or President Petro in Colombia, or López Obrador in Mexico, Lula da Silva again in Brazil, we don't see any change in how the model of these extractivist practices that rely on the extraction of natural products, keep deepening in the region. That's why I call it a trap. It's a trap because there are no governmental policies that simply can take 500 years of dependency away, and this is the interesting part, this is the second wave of pink tide governments, as also Vice President García Linera from Bolivia, maybe you heard of him, he said, well, this is the second pink tide government's wave, which is going to be even more related to white color than to red color, if we say pink, right? Because you call it a pink tide. We don't call it like that in Latin America. We say progressive governments, gobiernos progresistas. But the idea is that it's going to be even more difficult to try to change things radically right now, even though Latin America has been called or has been seen as a let's say, laboratory of anti-neoliberal policies. So I think it's going to be a struggle. That Lula is not a recipe or a solution for itself. He's going to see a lot of pressures from agribusiness. We are seeing that now with Mercosur-EU, for example. And Gabriel Boric, for example, in Chile, if you have followed the process, you see that it's already white. It's not even pink anymore, which is really, it's a lost opportunity for the Chilean people also. So, and the last thing, yeah, we shouldn't see the whole region as a whole, only in the economic way that the region has inserted itself in the global market, but then we have to see country by country, right? It's not the same situation in each country.
Okay, thank you. Just perhaps let me ask an add-on question. I mean, when you look at, the trade relations of Latin America vice versa the world 30 years ago, and when you look at the trade relations now, perhaps the biggest difference is the role of China in the continent. So my question to you is, how would you assess that role of China in the continent? Has it led to any kind of changes, or is it just basically, more of the same in terms of following extractivist practices? and not, you know, adding any kind of substantive quality changes to the economic model. So how would you assess the role of China? Yeah.
I think that China has been, in Latin America, China has been super intelligent. I mean, China, well, the Chinese strategizers and diplomats, right? They have been really intelligent. They have analyzed how the US policy has been in Latin America for the past 60 years, and they have done exactly the opposite to that. I mean, if you see, for example, the different, how do you say encuesta? The polls, thank you. Different polls, sometimes my brain doesn't work. It's the jet lag, sorry. If you see the polls, for example, in Latin America, there is still a high anti-American sentiment. Sandra was saying in the US, and this I found very interesting, there has always been an anti-Chinese sentiment in the US. You said, I didn't know about that, for example, but in Latin America, there has always been an anti-US sentiment. And so anything related to the US is seen as something that in the first, at first sight, you just doubt, right? When we were in the anti-ALCA campaign, in the anti-FTAA campaign, for example, 20 years ago, we used to explain people, do you want to vote against, yeah, we were doing a poll actually on this popular referendum on this, and we said, do you want to vote against FTAA? And people said, what is FTAA ALCA? And it was, well, it's a project of the US. Oh, if it's the US, I will vote against. It was like that. It was like, let me explain first. No, it's okay. So, okay. But with China, it's not the same. So actually, this is something that the Chinese have been really intelligent to do. We have to acknowledge that. Because they have been, for example, they went to Chile 10 years ago, and they said with Chile, we want your copper. We need your copper. The one that you're like one of the first providers of copper to the world. But what do you need? Well, we want a joint venture because the Chileans really have a sentiment on copper being national. And so they say, well, you have to privatize, as the US, Washington Consensus did. It's like, well, we'll do a joint venture. So they were really smart on that. And they went to Costa Rica and did the same. What do you need? Well, we want this. We want a stadium, the Costa Rica people said. And the Chinese built a stadium, a football stadium, for example, a huge one, beautiful one. And it's like, what? Well, yes, because it's something that the diplomats actually understood, that the way to deal with these countries had to be different than the US. And Argentina the same. What does Argentina need? Money to pay the external debt. So they said, okay, this is the swap, and this is country by country, they did exactly the same. It's not that the policy is completely the same when it comes to how to finish the agreements, because they actually get the free trade agreements with Peru, with Chile, with Costa Rica. Now they are negotiating with Ecuador. The Uruguayans say, from Uruguay, they said that they want to negotiate an FTA with China too. So we see that the policy in the deep part is kind of the same, but they have been really smart. So what we see there is a presence for infrastructure. We see energy projects, we see dams projects, train projects. So there's a lot related to infrastructure and putting a lot of money to guarantee presence, but with this intelligent point of view. Let's see where it leads, right?
Okay, thank you. So let me turn to Jürgen Knirsch. Jürgen Knirsch is joining us from Germany. He studied biology at the University of Bremen and then worked for many years, actually, I think 2 decades for Greenpeace in Germany, particularly on the trade policy dossier, particularly also, of course, on the relationship between trade and environmental issues, ecological issues. So he's got a lot of experience, particularly with respect to European Union trade policies. He's been active on many advocacy fronts, covering, all the famous agreements that we've talked about so much in the last 10 to 15 years. So thanks a lot for coming. We're very happy to have you with us. My first question to you would be, when we hear about what's going on the global level, how has that impacted the European Union approach to trade issues? What kind of changes do you see in Europe with respect to the trade policy agenda? And how do you assess what, for example, Sandra said, that the neoliberal consensus, at least as it refers to international economic policy making, has been more or less ruptured in the United States? Is that also true for the European Union? Would you say that the very prominent neoliberal approach that particularly the European Commission has taken over the last 25 years is receding, or how would you assess the situation? So please, floor is yours.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, and sorry for the delay. I had problems to find this place, but now I'm here and happy to answer the question and try to be short. So in 2019 we got a new EU Commission in October, and 2 months later we have the so-called EU Green Deal, which was, at least for me, or I think for a lot of people, a surprise that the new Commission started a whole package of initiatives for climate protection, environment, industry policies. It's a package of more than 150 individual measures, and some of them have good goals, if I'm looking from an environmental perspective, like the biodiversity strategy, the strategy for agriculture, the chemical strategy, or the due diligence legislation which is planned, or deforestation-free products. So there's a law planned on this. Saying they have good goals does not mean they might be good at the end, because we know we have the process. All these initiatives must pass the EU bodies, and they can be weakened, and also we have the problem that some member states have some other views on environmental and climate protection. So but it was a whole package, and I would say it was not really discussed, at least not in the civil society, because everybody was surprised, and that von der Leyen was launching this very soon. And then we got COVID-19, and there was a change in the debate, because now we learned that we must look on global supply chain, and it's often not a good idea to outsource all the production to other countries. And shortly after COVID, the war against Ukraine was started by Russia, and we got new other problems on global supply chain, meaning the trade of grain or fertilizers from Ukraine or Russia. And so this means there was a lot of attention on how to deal with COVID, how to deal with the war and the implications of the war, the sanctions and the broken supply chain. And I think this means there was less attention for environmental and climate protection measures. But not only for that, also for a lot of other issues like the international debt situation, the international health situation, apart from COVID. So this means these issues have not been in the forerun of the Commission, or could not be, if I will say it a little bit more friendly. And then we saw what was for us already explained by my colleagues. So if we are now looking on the trade policy of the European Union, we see everybody says there's a need. We have to do the trade agreements, let's say with EU Mercosur, because it's our friends, our partners, and we must look for them for a new or we must find every partner who is willing to do trade with us. And if you look on at least my German colleagues could explain it very better than I, but even in Germany there's a change in the green policy now saying we have to sign EU Mercosur. No doubt about it. We need trade relations, and yes, we can fix some environmental problems with some side agreements and so on, but if we don't do it, then China will do it. And China will do it in a more worse case than we. So there's always this China argument. And EU Mercosur, EU Chile, these agreements are needed to get resources, and also to get export markets. So this is now the situation. There are some discussions about sustainable development chapters in the trade agreements, also enforceable sustainable development chapters. We have already this kind of measures, but they are not enforceable. So I would say there's a pressure, or the Commission, also the German government, and also the Green economic minister are saying we must have this deal. Sorry, there's no other way, we must do this.
I think that's a very interesting point that you're referring to, this kind of ambivalence that we're seeing currently in the European Union trade policy. On the one hand, as you said, there are some, if you want, modest advances on issues like deforestation-free products with this regulation. There is the due diligence regulation discussion. There is a discussion on the trade and sustainability chapters and making them more binding. While at the same time, we are speaking about the green transformation and we speak about the European Green Deal and its kind of implementation acts, which then bring up this whole discussion about how to get access to what's called now critical raw materials. And for that reason, of course, we need the EU-Mercosur trade agreement and many other trade agreements or raw material partnerships, as they're called now, which basically just means, we have to kind of deepen the extractivist model for the sake of decarbonization, so to say. So these are kind of the ambivalences we are currently facing also in the European Union, and I think it's very pertinent also for our conference to discuss how to kind of transcend that kind of very contradictory discourse and what kind of alternatives in the end I think we can offer to progressive trade movements in terms of in terms of course implementing the much needed green socio-ecological transformation, while at the same time also trying to go beyond this kind of extractivist model that is so deeply entrenched in Latin America, but also in many other parts of what's now called the Global South. Okay, so thanks a lot for this first round. I would suggest that we now move to what I've just pointing at, namely the ideas and thoughts about how could we react to what's going on, what is needed in terms of priorities for a progressive trade agenda, given the changing circumstances that we're living through. So my first question again would be to you, Sandra. What do you see as starting points for a debate on a progressive trade agenda that can be supported by social movements, by NGOs, by the trade unions, given the current situation?
Yes, well, let me give you a very brief answer to that, because I know, Werner, that you want to get to a round of comments and questions from the audience, and I know there are a lot of very experienced people here with us today, and I'm eager to hear their views, but also to get their questions about particular U.S. policy matters that they might be interested in. So let me just throw out one idea, which on its, let me give a context and then throw out what may sound controversial as a proposal. In my view, an analytical starting point for how to think about a progressive reaction to what's happening today in global economic terms is that it's very important to resist this breaking of the world into blocks, into opposing geopolitical blocks. You have to start from that underlying point if you want to be able to evaluate all of these different currents and bilateral arrangements and sectoral and material arrangements and so on, because that will determine what happens at that next order, at the geopolitical order. And when you think about a world in blocks, and we of course lived through, everyone here I think is old enough to have lived with the Cold War bloc. What happens, maybe not, at least some part of it, what happens when the world is divided into blocks is that the big powers, certainly the hegemon in the case of the US, but the great powers that are playing that great game, evaluate everything in terms of how it will weaken the adversary, how it will weaken the other bloc, how it will undermine the potential for growth of the other bloc, how it will spread discontent in the citizens of the other bloc. Both sides do that. And they do that to a profound degree such that it distorts, I would say warps, virtually every policy consideration that goes across borders. And some that don't, because it has a cancerous effect within each bloc as well. Against that backdrop, I would propose that one idea is that many of us in the room, I think probably everyone on this panel and some in the audience, cut our teeth in policy debates over trade being opposed to the WTO. The WTO was born in the full flowering of the neoliberal period, and much of the WTO rulebook reflects this pro-capital, pro-market approach and discipline of governments against good domestic regulatory, et cetera, But the WTO also is the guardian, if you will, of basically the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, schedule of tariffs and market access and non-discrimination and most favored nation treatment. That core, that basic core of trade rules, which was developed over the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, that still, if you will, is the core of the WTO, now overlayered with a lot of bad neoliberal policies, which have to be fought and give rise to arguments and debates all the time. But that core of a rule book of tariffs, market access, non-discrimination, and most favored nation treatment of all member states is something that's very important for small economies, for whatever we call them now, the global south, the emerging market and developing countries, all of the acronyms that refer to the less powerful players in the global economy depend on that set of rules for how they are in the global economy. It may not be an ideal insertion at all, but if they do in fact have manufacturing, they know that they will have access to markets as long as the rules are followed at a certain tariff level, and their producers can plan to that. If you take that away at a time of whatever we will call it, multiple crises, polycrises in the world, all of the things that countries are facing, that small bit of predictability for their economies is a very important thing. And I think if you would have the leaders and responsible leaders of developing and emerging economies in the room, they would say, don't take the GATT away from us. Don't take that away now. We can fight the battles that we have to, but don't take that away from us. We need that small bit of, this little bit of anchor in the global economy. Fight about the things that we have to fight about. And now I'm not speaking for them, I'm speaking for progressives in general. The vaccine apartheid was fought at the WTO last year, the last 2 years. The battle was not won, but advances were made in terms of how the WTO rulebook on intellectual property has to be approached, and that debate is still going on. How disputes are settled, the European Union, I think, made a good initiative in creating the MPIA, the
multilateral agreement, you mean?
No, the alternative dispute settlement. It's an alternative dispute. The U.S. blocked the appellate body of the WTO because they didn't like being ruled against. And so, led by Europe, but with a lot of other countries, there are now 53 countries, a lot of developing countries, including all of the European countries also, in the WTO, who have an alternative way of resolving their disputes, and it seems to be working. The US has not joined, UK has not joined. Those who really want to have this hegemonic veto over the WTO are not joining, but it's working for a number of countries. So there are things that can be done. So again, I say that as what would sound to the people who knew me as a researcher, campaigner, the person who launched a model that described the WTO round as one of winners and losers that was then seized on by a number of developing countries to help resist the WTO. Nevertheless, I can see that core of GATT tariffs and rules is an advantage that should not be taken away.
Okay, so thanks. I guess a couple of people in the room have been on the streets in the 2000s shouting "Derail the WTO." So I'm interested in their reactions to that proposal that you just gave us. In terms of, if I understood it correctly, remaining some the basic principles of the WTO as it is enshrined in the GATT agreement. But I mean that the major point that you're making, and I think that's very welcome in that context, is that it is really pertinent to think about ways to kind of reinvigorate or to lay a new basis for international cooperation and for maintaining that approach towards a multilateral or a cooperative international order in terms of economic interchange. So, Luciana, floor is yours. What are your key ideas?
Yes, we have a moment then to respond afterwards, right? Because I want to respond to Sandra, but I want to say something different also. So, no, when you know, I've been working on trade and investment issues like for 20 years or plus, a little more than 20 years now. And we always have this problem on when we have to think of the alternatives on where to go. It's always easier to say no. But I want to say something else regarding that, the alternatives, why it is so difficult to think on alternatives. And I come from a Marxist approach to how I see the world. And I cannot but understand trade related directly to the world, to the way we produce. I mean, when we say trade issues, it's like actually seeing half of the problem, seeing like with one eye the problem, right? I cannot imagine trade alternatives without thinking of a different world. There won't be, actually, my hypothesis, there won't be trade alternatives without changing the way we produce and consume. How did Marx see it? And I think that is super interesting to still analyze, and this is something for discussion with academia and discussion with movements also. Something from the academia we should give to the movements. We should give them the whole picture. So how is it we understand? It's commodities are produced in the industry, and they have to be no, it's like well, I don't know how to say it in English, but they only come to life when they are sold in the market. That is trade, that is circulation. That is the part we are always in know, the vessels and the GATT and WTO and the tariffs. But there is no tariffs or there is no trade without the way we produce in capitalism. So if we don't see the whole picture, we cannot analyze trade alternatives by themselves. It's like illogical or even irrational to think of trade alternatives without seeing the whole picture. So you need to open the other eye too and analyze how things are produced. And then how things are produced will give you the answer to how things are traded. Right now, trade is related especially to making profit, because that is how this society works. So the profit comes from having 2,000, 3,000 vessels all over the seas right now, taking who knows what commodities from China or elsewhere. 90% of the trade, of the global trade, is done by vessels, by these huge ships. And these huge ships, each one of them contaminates the same as 220,000 diesel cars, like the Volkswagen cars, okay? So what are we talking about? I mean, what's the logic of this? I don't know if you saw, well, in Argentina it became very famous by Twitter, I think. There was like this small package of pears, you know, the fruit pears, like pears, that they were pears. This small package said, pears, not produced, but come from Argentina, which we have a lot of production of fruits, like peaches and pears in Patagonia, packed in Indonesia, and somebody took the picture of this package in Miami, Florida. So pears that came from Argentina went by a vessel to Indonesia to be packed, and then they were consumed in Miami. So you think, something is not right here, right? I mean, it's like, I have never been to Indonesia. I have always been, only been in the US once in my life, I think. But these peers have traveled a lot. These are huge tourists, right? The big tourists. And we have examples of that, of crazy trade. Why do we have crazy trade? Why do we have potatoes in Peru, which is like the cradle of potatoes in the whole world? They have like 100 different types of potatoes packed in the Netherlands, created as French fries, frozen French fries, and then sent back to Peru, where they don't have industry for making frozen French fries. I mean, I'm not talking about a vaccine. I'm talking about frozen French fries. So we have 15,000 kilometers to go from Peru, so I think that they have to like go south, I don't know how, because it's a vessel of Panama Channel to get to the Netherlands, to Rotterdam, and then go back. So this is just two simple examples to show how illogical trade relations are. but they're illogical from a human rights point of view, from labor rights point of view, from environmental rights point of view, but they are not irrational for the logic of capital, because that makes profit. To somebody, it makes sense to pack pears that come from Argentina to Indonesia and then sell them in the United States. To somebody, that makes sense. To somebody who's earning money from that process. So that's the thing that we have to understand, that we have to be able to put out there the illogical way that this trade system works when we think about life. Because for somebody, this makes sense. For me, it doesn't, but for somebody, it does. To bring these products from China, bringing all the iPhones to San Francisco by plane. And it's thousands of planes, because it's very small, so they realize that they don't need a ship to take to San Francisco the iPhones, because it's a very small box, right? So let's put them on planes. They go really, really fast to San Francisco, and they sell. So this is the logic of capital. We have to explain the logic of capital to understand trade and to think of alternatives that are overall alternatives, not only alternatives to trade. Thank you.
Thank you. So if you've raised the systemic issue, if I might call it like that, which is certainly something that we also have to contemplate very deeply in this conference. But that is, obviously a long-term agenda, I would say. Are there any, and I turn to Jürgen, when we talk about European trade policies, what you've been advocating in terms of, I think, what's being called a progressive European, or the alternative trade mandate, I think it's been called. So in terms of those policy agendas that the advocacy groups, campaigners have used in the last 15 to 20 years, is that still fit for purpose from your point of view, or what would you change?
There are a lot of studies, papers, proposals from the civil society organizations. This so-called alternative trade mandate, which is 10 years old, which had a specific purpose to influence the EU election in 2015. So there's so much, and I think nobody has a full picture of all the proposals. But there are also some problems. The systematic problems, I will come later to this, because I see also a need and an urgent need to solve this. But for civil society organizations, there is always the need to say we must find an alternative to a free trade agreement or to the WTO. And then a group of people are working and making concepts and looking on different issues like agriculture, environment, democracy, trade aspects, gender aspects, and so on. And then you have a paper, which is often wonderful, but then the problem starts. There was so many energy put into the production of the paper, but there's not so much energy to work with the paper. And I can say it from my own experience with Greenpeace. So we also produce some of this kind of stuff, and then everybody is happy and say, oh, we have our 10 principles, now everything is solved. No, the problem is somebody has to see if all the paper fit together or not. Where are the differences? Where are the contradictions? And having a paper also means you must have a process. What will you do with the paper? What are your critical points, milestones? What would you like to see changed? So this is a process which is not really organized. So I think some of the colleagues from the NGOs can share my experience that you are happy if you have done the paper, but you are not able to do more than produce or print the paper. So how to bring it in the political process and so on. So this is a critical point, and perhaps we can find over the weekend some solution how to deal, at least to have a database of all good visions paper or whatever. But coming back to the systemic point, I see it like Luciana. So trade is in between production and also consumption on the other side. And we cannot only look on trade, we have to see on the production side and on the consumption side. And we must also look on critical groups working on production or growth, the degrowth groups, or also groups which are against unlimited consumption. So I think we must have a deeper look on the 3 points, and also to look on the labor issue, which is relevant, because if you say you don't like to have cheap products, then you must also deal with the people who have not so much income. So this is a systemic approach, and I think we must cover this. But allow me one point, because this was my planned starting point. For the EU, I think before the EU is going ahead with some new ideas, they have to say, sorry. They have to admit the colonial heritage Europe has, and say, we have treated you in a very bad way. And without such a process, we have always the conflicts in the World Trade Organization between the Global South and the Global North. The Global North makes some proposals. The Global South are saying this is a continuation of the exploitation of our countries. If you look on climate issues, you have the same. There's always this conflict, and somebody has to start the conflict, to solve the conflict. And this should be the European Union saying, we have done a lot of mistakes, we are sorry, and let's talk about how to solve this, and what is your what do you need that the mistakes are or would be overcome.
So you're basically proposing the decolonization of trade, so to say, trade relations between the global north and the global south. Okay, thanks a lot for that. So we've had 2 rounds of questions and answers on the panel. So now let me also move to give you in the audience a chance to make a comment, a question, to pose a question. In terms of organizational issues, you will have to wait until the microphone is given to you. So please speak in the microphone. And in terms of sticking to our schedule, please be very concise and short in your comments and remarks. So we start here with the gentleman.
Hi, the gentleman's name is Paul Fauteux. I'm a lawyer from Montreal, and I really want to hear the second thing Luciana wanted to say.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So the lady over there with the blue dress.
Hi, thanks. Silke Trommer, University of Manchester. I wanted to make a comment and also ask a question. The comment goes to the WTO point. So I kind of agree with you, Sandra, and disagree with you at the same time. I'm going to be kind of really quick, try to anyway. So I think one of the problems with the GATT is the structural inequality of the global economy was written into that, and we knew that at the latest since 1958, since the Harper report. So it's a bit that problem that is it Luciana mentioned? It's like you need to imagine a different world to have a different trade organization. But I think at the same time, what the GATT WTO did for a while, and we know this, it gave poorer countries possibilities of bargaining collectively, right? And we had the consensus and the single undertaking that allowed kind of making bargains across issue areas. And actually, if you look at what happened, we get Cancun, 2003, and it blows up, and right away the US and the EU, they all go bilateral, right? And they say, and when you talk to them, they said this kind of during the end of the Doha round explicitly, the single undertaking is a problem, the consensus rule is the problem. So it's like that's saying we gave power to these countries, and that was the problem. And I think if we need to think about, because actually I still am a trade multilateralist, also because the FTA network is so much worse, right? It's so much worse, both in terms of contents of the rules that are being perpetuated, but also the fact that by its sheer complexity, it's impossible to know what goes on. Trade negotiators in DG Trade in the Commission have said to me, nobody knows how all of these FTAs relate to each other. That invariably empowers those actors that can hire lawyers, economists to sit down and figure it out, right? So I think we need something that's multilateral. We need something that empowers the smaller countries. What that then is, I don't know. So just a question to Luciana, and that's going to be really quick. Obviously, you would remember ALBA. And during the COVID pandemic, I saw them issue a statement, and I went, oh, I thought they were dead, and now there's some statement. And so I was just wondering if you could update us on what's happened, and do you think that's maybe an alternative model? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Josef Baum, gentleman in the back.
So I doubt that is right that we live in a polarized world. So I can understand from a perspective of Central Europe, we have this Cold War, we have this Ukraine war and so on, and there are plans. The US intended a Cold War against China, of course. But I think the real new essential things are that the BRICS will be enlarged. We have some tendencies to de-dollarization and so on. And I think you never will, India, for example, will not be in one of these blocks in the next decades. So I think if we discuss alternatives, we should see these important new tendencies and how to react from Europe to these new tendencies.
Thank you, Josef Baum. Bettina Müller, and then the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting panel. Bettina Müller from German NGO PowerShift and Dutch NGO Institute TNI. I have a small comment, or rather, like a replique to what you said, Werner, because I really don't think that the systemic question and change should be on the long-term agenda, because we just don't have that much time anymore. We should rather quickly react, because as you referred to in the presentation in the beginning, we're living in a world of acute crises, one of them being climate change, and the current trade model and the current model of production and consumption has actually led us to where we are today, which is this world of multiple crises. So I was wondering, taking into account that we rather urgently need to put forward the systemic question, but that this is not on the table. I mean, my colleague Jürgen actually told you that in the European Union, we're doing a lot of very small reforms and steps, but nothing really, deep, let's say. My question would be to the three panelists, do you have any ideas on how we could put that issue back on the table and really speed up change? I know that is a very overall arty question, but maybe you have some ideas how to put that back on the table and really make it an urgent request.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman in the back. Are there any other wishes to take the floor? Otherwise, I will then go back to the panel. So please.
Thank you. My name is Ghiotto from the Netherlands. I'm a coordinator of the Agriculture Coalition for Just Trade. We work with farmers' organizations. Also, reaction to Sandra Polaski on WTO. I don't agree. Especially not in agriculture. We still like food sovereignty, that you can feed your own people. And what you said is that I think the WTO rules are now based on what TNCs want, transnational corporations. They have the same and even more rights than national or domestic small, medium enterprises and farmers. And why should that be? Why cannot a government choose to increase jobs, to protect farmers, protect food security? Why should TNCs have the same right than those domestic producers? And the other thing is that on the current WTO, the rules are only based on the products itself. Production, processing methods are not that case. We cannot stop products with lower standards where forests are cut for. So this, and then a third thing I have to say, even when Europe was self-sufficient in beef, with the WTO agreement on agriculture, we had to import tariff rate quota. So that's an example that those transnational corporations want to open anyway the markets, even you are self-sufficient. And then you get those trade streams like Luciana said. So I agree with you that we need multilateral rules, but do you think we can still change the WTO, or what I would propose to go to the UN or UNCTAD with real fair rules? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's go back perhaps to the panel. I mean, a couple of very interesting issues were raised. The first issue, how can we speed up systemic change? That is something that, simple question that Luciana will take on in a minute. We've also had a couple of issues or questions raised to the issues of governance. Is WTO reform or some kind of reduced international trade organization the way to go forward? Or do we need something different within the framework of the United Nations or UNCTAD or any other alternative governance mechanisms? That's also something I think is important. And the third issue that I've taken from Josef Baum is his observation that the international economic system seems to shift also in terms of emerging economies going towards a different direction. There's much talk now about active non-alignment or alignment 2.0. Which is promoted by Brazil and other countries. There is talk about de-dollarization, as Josef has remarked. So isn't there kind of a strategic project being constituted at the international level, promoted by the BRICS group or some other countries that really wants to shift the constitutional order of the international system, and shouldn't we support that, or shouldn't we kind of also take that into account when discussing about alternatives? So that were just a couple of the issues that were raised. I leave it to you to address whatever you deem fit, and perhaps start with Sandra.
I wasn't surprised that my comment on the WTO is controversial. and I started out by saying that I was on the front lines of the campaigns against particular rounds of the WTO, particular issues, for decades. And yet, if we look at the questions we have in front of us, and I would just kind of, to help think about it, propose a hierarchy. The systemic issues of a world which is dominated by the capitalist system is the highest level of order that we have, the most problematic, one could say, and the most difficult to change, and the one that is not susceptible to specific things that we can do this year that will produce the result that we want. So we can agree on that issue. That's at that level. A number of the questions of how countries produce, the question of small and medium agricultural producers and so on, are embedded in that, but they are also in some ways embedded in the point that I was making, the very practical point about the WTO. Some of those producers, although the rules of the WTO are unfair, the entire layer of neoliberal regulation is unfair, unattractive, and should be challenged. Nevertheless, some multilateral organization that has rules that can bind across different levels of power, different levels of wealth of countries, different interests in different parts of the world. Some multilateral organization is better than none, and I would argue that for all of its faults, the advantage of the WTO over the UN is that it has at least some minimal enforcement power. The big powers can defy enforcement, as the US has, and simply said we're not going to accept the rulings. But most countries and the European Union, certainly the 53 countries that got into the MPIA, Alternative Dispute Settlement, and in my experience at the WTO, most of the large and medium developing and emerging economies think that that rule system, as flawed as it is a lot better than not having any multilateral rule system that they can refer to, that they can appeal to. And I would argue, I put it in the context of the analytical risk of dividing the world into blocks, which is a lower level than the systemic issue, because the blocks that we're talking about would be capitalist on both sides. Maybe with some moderation in some parts, but there would be capital. So it doesn't solve it. But on that level, having a multilateral organization to turn to use is going to empower countries to not be sucked into one block or the other. You take away those common rules of trade, and I can tell you that an individual country, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in Latin America or in Africa, is going to have a lot more pressure. Now they have no rules. They have to go with one side or the other, which means that they are going to limit their possibilities for development if they do that. And so it's in that context that I defend that idea of preserving, not defending the WTO, but preserving it from attacks. And the attacks will be coming from big powers, including the US, and have been.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. We certainly have a chance to explore that in more detail tomorrow and also on Sunday. I think it was Bob Jessup who said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So, Luciana, what's your idea about that?
Yeah, easy one also. No, yes, the thing is that I was thinking, no, again, I understand the difficulty of what we are discussing, because I think that this is a group of people that can actually go to that place where we can make it more difficult than it really is. 20 years ago, again, I'm with the 20 years, sorry, I sound like a tango already, sorry for this, but 20 years ago, I remember that when I started being an activist on these topics, people used to say, and I remember this phrase, we have the same diagnosis on how things are working bad. What we don't have is an agreement between organizations on the alternatives. That was something that everybody said, no, we know how this works badly, but we don't agree on how or what should be done. I think that these past years, the problem is that we don't even agree on what's going on. So we don't even have a common diagnosis on what is going on. The changes are being so fast, and we're still, some of us, I will try to be out of that group, but what I see is that we still analyze the world with the neoliberal framework of the 90s. That is not necessarily correct for nowadays. This is a complete different situation. Everything is going really fast. We can say with this idea of levels that I agree with how Sandra put it, I agree absolutely. This idea of maybe how the systemic world works is the same, but the forms, the way that it is developing is different than the 90s. And we have this problem of diagnose. What the hell is going on? How do we approach this? So the thing is that what I think is, and that what I bring to Latin American academia, and I want to bring here also, is the responsibility that we have as analysts, as people that work on these issues, to paint the whole picture. That's why I bring this. So first of all, we have to understand how this works, because otherwise we might tend to have a small analysis of the picture, and that will not give us the right diagnosis. And of course, if we don't have the right diagnosis, we're not going to find the alternatives. So this is like, you know, if you don't have the train from the beginning, then you're going to just lose the back of the train. And regarding that, so, and also on what Sandra was saying, and this is the second point that I wanted to discuss, is like, I understand that point of view. I completely understand that. But then on the other hand, when we analyze the relationship between states and the space for policy making, what we find is that WTO has brought to those countries, the smallest one and the middle ones, like Argentina, for example, it has brought chains to policy making, and that has not changed. So Trump was right when he said that. Huh? I think that Trump showed in a very pervert way how things really work. I think he was really wise in that way. I usually say that in my classes, and my students are like, what is the woman saying? But I think that he was really, he was right. I mean, the problem for the US was NAFTA, and the problem for the US is China. And everybody sees that, but well, he took it to another place. But we see that too. This is a problem. WTO is a problem too. I mean, Argentina had to find the ways, and I know from policymakers with Kirchner government that all the policymakers were like breaking their brains. They are trying to find the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, ways to, what can we do inside this agreement to try to have some policy to try to make some small development and stop the imports from China, for example, without being taken to the, how is it in Spanish, is the órgano de solución de controversias, so thank you. So how do we avoid that, even though they found a way, but they were taken by the European Union, for example, to that organ? Because the thing is that Argentina was violating the GATT. So that's the thing. The thing is that still we find that WTO, although I understand that point of view, I also understand the point of view that from the development point of view, WTO doesn't allow for countries to actually have policies to develop, for example, in Latin America. So that is a problem that we have, not only for the small islands that sell something, but I mean for the countries that have tried to develop a medium policy of industrial policy like they did in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So that's thing. And the last thing that I want, how to speed up, Bettina, I have no idea. We can discuss that with the wine afterwards. Maybe we'll have better ideas with wine. But the ALBA question is very interesting because the ALBA countries, the ALBA in itself was a big question mark. Do you know how the ALBA idea came into being? This is, I have to say it because it's very interesting. It turns out that some people say that that President Hugo Chavez once, they were fighting ALCA, right? So he was in a meeting that lasted long, and so the sun started going up, and he said, we need a new ALBA, a new sun going down, so go and create ALBA. It's a new integration for Latin America. And all the policymakers of Venezuela were like, what the hell is ALBA? What should we be doing? I don't know. So this is something that people usually say because they have no idea what, and this shows we have no idea what alternatives look like. It's so, it's Bob Jessup, yeah, he was right, surely. I mean, the idea, and I don't know if it was Jessup actually, but the idea of not being able to imagine something different. And all the alternatives that we can think of go through the states. We don't even analyze, we're not analyzing states here. Is the state the way to carry out the alternatives? Well, that is a question. I have my position, but I'm sure that we won't agree. If we are 40 people, maybe we will find 30 different positions on what to do with the states. And this is a very long-standing discussion. Sometimes it's seen as theoretical, but it's actually super political. It's really the states can do this. In Latin America, they have tried through the states. And they have found the limits of trying to make changes in a state that has to actually develop all the economic groups inside your territory, even in Argentina, for the agribusiness. And you have to keep your frontiers open, and you have to keep free market, and you have to be liberal. So this is the difficulty that ALBA also found. So right now, it's not ongoing. Right now, there are some policies between Venezuela and Bolivia, but still it's in a huge crisis. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for explaining the ALBA idea and how it came into being. Jürgen, please.
Yes, it's already a lot mentioned, so it's, but I will come back to Bettina's point of the need, and we can discuss trade policies. We have discussed trade policy, a lot of us, since more than 20 years, or since the start of the WTO, but the time is running, and we don't have enough resources to trade what we like to trade. And so if everybody should have the same right to buy things or to own things, we know it's not possible at the moment. And I'm coming from a country where we have a party who is always talking about technology, new technology developments, and not saying something concrete, but technology will solve the problem. I don't see it. And I think Luciana has mentioned a good point. We have the responsibility to think what we can do. And we have done a lot, but we have not done enough. At least we should try what are tools, also try it in a risky way, say, perhaps this is, we think it could be an idea, perhaps it's not a good idea. Then starts the next. But we have to do something. That's the problem.
We have to do something. That's a good final word. Yeah, well, we have 2 days to figure it out. The next thing that we should do tonight, I think, is get a drink and some food. I can already smell the food now. If there is no urgent need to ask any more questions or make any more comments, I would say, okay, let's translate ourselves to the ground floor of this building where drinks and food is waiting for all of us. So thanks a lot to our panelists for a very good opening debate. And have a very nice evening downstairs. We reconvene tomorrow, starting with the registration at 8:30, and we'll start with the first panel at 9:15 a.m. in the morning. Here again. So have a very nice evening, and I see you all tomorrow after our informal dinner now. Thank you.